Hello and welcome to another episode of the Misinformation Podcast, the podcast that was voted #1 podcast in the world in my household. I'm Z, aka The Reluctant Accountant, and as ever, I am delighted to be here with you today. So in this episode, I want to do something slightly different, and I'm going to make the case for reparations of a single nation. Now, when I do this, please do not hate me. I am not by any means suggesting that other nations aren't entitled to reparations, but I want to look at this specific country and I want to niche down there simply because I think it's a story that kind of gets overlooked, especially given the state of that country currently. And I know that reparations and the whole kind of idea of reparations can be quite a contentious subject matter. When you bring it up, people will cite things like, the passage of time between the egregious acts that were supposedly committed and today, and how could we possibly, equivocate that with money? What could we possibly do to repair the damage that has done? And so that's an argument against it that's used. And I feel like, to be honest, that argument's made in bad faith. And it may not be intentionally made in bad faith, but it is, because I'm going to present you with a few stories that show why that argument actually may be just rooted in the way that we view acts and heinous acts from the past, and we don't do it on equal footing. So we have this measure of greatness that we apply to various acts and various leaders that isn't universally applied. So I'm going to explain what I mean. So we often, I think, quite unfairly measure the greatness of an individual, the greatness of that person, specifically when it comes to leaders, based on the legacy and the greatness of things that they may have left behind. So they can be shrouded in greatness and adored by some people, and to others, they are the epitome of evil. A good example of this, for example, is Winston Churchill. In this country, in the UK, he was once referred to as one of the greatest Britons to have ever lived. And certainly in the Western world, he's looked at as this mighty force that staved off and held strong and saved the UK from the Nazis. However, in other parts of the world, he's seen as directly responsible for the deaths of millions of people. And so we know that human beings are nuanced. We know that they're complex beings, but we rarely afford this to other people. And there's a kind of diminishing return the further away someone is from us. So specifically in the West, the further the countries are and the leaders are from what we consider to be in proximity to us, we tend to give them less grace when we're looking at things that they've done. So if I were to tell you a story, for example, about a country that suffers from extreme water scarcity, and this is a condition that impacts millions within that country, forcing them to live in a very precarious situation and deal with all of the risks that are associated with lack of access to fresh water. And then what if I told you about a leader that oversaw one of the greatest engineering projects that country had ever seen? He oversaw the building of a pipeline that spanned the length of the country and channeled high-quality fresh water from ancient aquifers beneath the Sahara to the coastal regions where the majority of the population lived. That sounds like a magnificent feat, doesn't it? It was such a great project that since 1989, it's played a vital role in bringing fresh water to those people, those millions that live in those coastal regions. Now, what if I told you that the leader I'm talking about was the late Muammar Gaddafi? The same Gaddafi that's accused of heinous crimes, the same Gaddafi that was overthrown following the Arab Spring in October 2011, the same Gaddafi that we saw awful images of him being dragged through the street after he had been killed. So does this water project that he accomplished in his lifetime overshadow all the heinous acts that he's also accused of? I think that a lot of people would say no. I think they'd also argue that it would probably be in very bad taste to erect statues of Gaddafi, even though he'd achieved something that was really quite formidable. Yet in Europe and the United States, we do this all the time. We're quite happy to erect these monuments of equally divisive individuals who've carried out heinous crimes. For example, in Madrid, in Puerta del Sol Plaza, there is a statue of King Carlos III. And he's kind of revered in that he really helped modernize the city. He brought lighting, sewage, and a really great rubbish system. So that's really quite a great project. What if I told you that King Carlos III also was the owner of 1,500 enslaved Africans within the Iberian Peninsula and 18,500 enslaved Africans in the Spanish colonies? Which of those acts take precedence? Is it okay to ignore the harm that was inflicted on all of these people because Madrid has good lighting? And people might turn around and argue like, well, that was kind of a while ago. We can't really do anything about that. Okay, fine. So we have modern day examples of things happening. If we look at the things that Jimmy Savile did, for example, would it be right to erect a statue of him? Absolutely not. And people might say, well, that's the difference. Jimmy Savile's happened recently and our moral compass has changed and we're so much better people, yada, yada, yada. And that's fine. I think we can probably agree that just over these generations, our moral compass has swayed a little bit more towards the humanity of all. Only a little bit. I mean, let's not pat ourselves too much on the back, because if we now know better, shouldn't we do better? So, for example, in 1945, World War II ended. And the decade since then has seen this kind of enormous endeavor to help pay reparations to the victims of the Nazi Holocaust. Not only to the direct victims, but also to their descendants. Now, I'm not going to dive into that subject matter at all, but I do want you to note the date, 1945, and how for decades after there has been this concerted effort to repair the damage, financially at least. Because 2 years later, in 1947, France received their own reparations. Not because they were the victims of anything, in fact, quite the opposite. You see, in 1804, Haiti became the first state to win its independence from their former colonizers, following the revolt of the enslaved people. So nowadays, we have this idea, even if it isn't always practiced, that most people should have this right to self-determination. And this is an amazing feat that was accomplished by the enslaved Africans, along with help from, some other, Polish people and other people in Haiti. This was an amazing feat for them to overthrow their owners, their oppressors in 1804. And this idea of self-determination, you would think that this was a great thing. But at the time, Haiti was made a pariah state in the world, and they were ostracized. This was an independent, black-led state during a time of brutal, white-led colonization and brutalization. This was a threat to European supremacy. To have a black-led, independent nation thriving, it was not going to be allowed to happen. Other nations could not ignore this. They couldn't have Haiti doing well and self-governing and thriving under these circumstances, because that would be a threat to their livelihoods, which relied on enslaved Africans to bring them so much wealth and so much prosperity. And they didn't want this vision of some sort of paradise over in Haiti filtering through to the enslaved Africans and emboldening them to take on their own revolutions. And when we see Haiti today, when you look at Haiti today, it would be easy to kind of dismiss them as just being quite unlucky because they have a geographical location that sees them experiencing really bad hurricanes and earthquakes and, blaming the topography of the land. But just remember that Haiti was once the crown jewels in the French Empire. Indeed, it was the most lucrative colony in the world. So you can imagine this lucrative colony now being independent, the threat that posed to the Western world, that were knee deep in their own brutal regime. So what did they do? Well, President Thomas Jefferson worked really hard to destabilize and ostracize Haiti. He worked hard to isolate them diplomatically and to strangle them economically. And indeed, United States only recognized Haiti as an independent state in 1862. That was over half a century post-revolution. So Haiti has, on the one side, this big power in the United States, really actively working to make sure that they don't thrive. And then there's also France. So one thing about France is that they are very bitter in a divorce. And indeed, what they did to Haiti after was truly nasty work. So in 1825, French King Charles sends a flotilla of army ships over to Haiti, and they demand 150 million French francs in exchange for diplomatic recognition. That debt was meant to compensate French colonists, i.e. slave owners, for the revenue that they lost due to them now not having their slaves. And so to pay this, Haiti was forced to take out a high interest loan, which amounted to 80% of their annual national budget. And so the irony of referring to this as a debt when it's quite clearly a ransom is ridiculous to me. So let's get this straight. So you kidnap people from their country, bring them to another country, to another land that they're unfamiliar with, force them to work for you, enslave them against their will and working for your benefit. And then those people rise up and they free themselves and they manage to force you out. And then they defend themselves again against multiple attempts by you to re-enslave them. And then you say to them, you need to repay us for our losses? The math is not mathing, as the kids would say. You really therefore believe that you are entitled to their bodies and to their lives and to their labor. I'm lost for words. So in 2015, the World Bank actually said about Haiti that the biggest political problem they have is that the social contract between the government and the citizens is missing. And I think this kind of ignores the decades, or rather centuries, of destabilization that has taken place and the direct interference from external forces. I mean, apart from Thomas Jefferson running interference in Haiti in the early 19th century, the United States actually violently occupied the island for 19 years in the early 20th century. And they only officially left Haiti in 1934. In fact, they controlled Haiti's public finances up until 1947. Yes, the very same year that Haiti managed to pay off its ransom to France. And so during that period, 40% of Haiti's national income was being siphoned off away to service the ransom payments to France and the United States. So let's map this out a little bit. So for around 125 years, Haiti had to pay a ransom to its former captors. They had to deal with external interference. They had to deal with these people destabilizing and putting in puppet governments for them. And they also had geographical issues such as hurricanes and earthquakes and the like. So when we're considering the position of Haiti today, we can't do that in a vacuum. They didn't arrive in their situation by accident. Indeed, I would argue that it was by design, through the systemic and systematic manipulation and extortion that they face from much larger organizations and countries. And so when I make the case for reparations for Haiti, I think those things need to be considered. This wasn't a singular event in time. It didn't end, indeed it didn't end with slavery, but continued for hundreds of years after that. And this argument that we hear all the time, that how would you do this? How can we possibly fix this and make reparations for these people? It's going to be so difficult because yada, yada, yada. They are just that. They're arguments, because we can do this. Because if we manage to find a way to process reparations for some of the victims and their descendants of Nazi brutality, then we can definitely try to find a path to right the wrongs that saw a ransom paid off just 2 years later. A ransom payment that did not by any means mark the end of external interference. And so in the case of Haiti, I definitely think that this usual argument that we have that talks about this passage of time is kind of nullified. Because whilst Haiti took their freedom in 1804 by a revolt by the enslaved people, actually, these Western powers have managed to find a way to keep them in bondage for hundreds of years later. And so if hundreds of years later, we're making the argument that at this point in time, our moral compass has changed and certain things are no longer acceptable, then let's make sure we show that they are no longer acceptable. And let's make those strides to make those reparations. Well, that's all I've got time for today. Thank you for joining me again for another episode of the Misinformation Podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment telling me how much you've enjoyed it. And also just carry on the conversation. You know, it doesn't have to end with the end of the podcast. If you've got something to say, definitely say something in the comments and I will do my best to get back to everybody that does comment. If you would like to get in touch with me directly, please feel free to email. The email address is themisinformationpodcast, that's miss with 2 S's, @gmail.com. That's themisinformationpodcast@gmail.com. I'm also on social media. I'm on TikTok at The Reluctant Accountant and Instagram on the same handle, The Reluctant Accountant. So until next week, thank you and stay safe.